Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Bintou and I'm so glad to have you here. We have reached the end of October, which means that it is time for another monthly wrap up. October was a pretty good month, kind of like as I predicted. Starting in September, the amount of books that I read per month has dwindled significantly because work has picked back up. I am still working from home, which means that I still have enough time to read more than I would if we were back in the full swing of things, but definitely been seeing a decline in the number of books that I read. However, I did hit a major milestone that I'll talk about later on. And with that said, nothing to it but to get to it. I kind of really enjoyed the format that I used in my last monthly wrap up, where first I talk about all of my most favorite books in the month, and then I talk about the ones that were a little bit less impressive. Instead of going in the order that I have read them, I think that's actually a lot more interesting. So I'll begin with the book that was the knockout for the month. And before I get into that, I'd like to ask you guys to leave a comment below. What was your knockout book for the month? If you only read one book this month, then go ahead and write that as well. So, first book I'm going to talk about is One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson. This book has been on my TBR for quite a while, since way back in like May. I think right around when I first started my booktube channel. It's been on my radar, I've been meaning to read it, and I just hadn't gotten around to it, but I knew that I wanted to read it before November, or in other words, before election day, and I finally got it done. I don't know what took me so long. However, I will say this book is really actually quite short. It looks longer than it is because the book is actually complete right around the 50% mark. The rest of it is just notes for the book. One Person, No Vote was also my 100th book of the year 2020. I remember saying in a video way back when I didn't think I would be able to hit 100 books this year, but I've done it. I hit 100 books this year, and we'll see what I end up hitting before the year is out. But I'm super excited about that. I think this is actually the most number of books I've ever read in a year in my life, and we can thank quarantine partially for that. So One Person, No Vote is focused on voting, and the book starts off with a history of disenfranchisement of African Americans specifically. And this is something that if you've read her book White Rage or We Are Not Yet Equal, both of which I've already read, then a little bit of that is going to be repetition. And I was afraid of that because I feel like the two books that I read for her already were very, very similar, and I didn't want that to be the case with this book. But that wasn't really the case after the first chapter. So she gives us a brief history on how Southern states in particular have infringed on the voting rights of African Americans in the past. And then most of the rest of the book is actually focused on present day. So she focuses on voter ID laws, voter roll purging, and gerrymandering as methods that politicians have used to try to keep down the minority votes. And this includes African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans, particularly after those three groups pretty much carried Barack Obama to the White House for both of his terms. I really enjoyed reading this book because I like Carol Anderson's writing. I think that her writing she writes about really important subjects, but she writes them in a very accessible manner. And it's obviously very well researched. She is a professor at a university. However, it doesn't read like an academic research paper that kind of just goes over your head. It's very much meant for the average person who wants to know a little bit more about the topic that she's writing on, in this case, voting rights, to be able to pick it up and read it pretty quickly and understand everything she's trying to say and get the main point of the book. This was also a very, very frustrating book to read because it is just, it was so enraging for me to keep reading about all of the ways that politicians have prevented millions of Americans from exercising their right to vote. And the fact that, they're trying to turn voting into a privilege that people have to earn rather than a right that they have as citizens. And whether it's something like requiring IDs, like driver's licenses, to vote, and then shutting down all the DMVs in poor neighborhoods, or putting voting stations so far away that people without vehicles are unable to access them, it's really unbelievable. And I feel very lucky to live in a state where we have mail-in voting and we have these poll drop-off locations in very, very convenient places all over the city. So for me, voting is very easy to do where I live. The book ends, and I love the way that it ended because it does like a case study of sorts in Alabama, and shows how all of these people can come together and work together to inform, provide resources like transportation for minorities that would otherwise not be able to vote. And so as a result, their voting power was able to increase far more than the state officials thought that they would. This was definitely a 5-star read. I know Nonfiction November is coming up, so if you were thinking about reading this would be a recommendation for Nonfiction November. Fantastic, highly recommend it. I also listened to the audiobook while I was reading this book. That's kind of my favorite way. Like with nonfiction, I kind of have to do that because otherwise it would take me way too long to get through the books. All right, next book on my list is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. So I did a whole reading vlog on Pet Sematary. This was my first time reading that particular novel, and it was one of 2 October sort of horror book picks. So the basic premise of the story is Lewis, he moves into a new town in Maine with his family. That includes his wife, his young daughter, and his young son, Gage. And he's working as a doctor in the university hospital. And the house that they move into is on a street where these massive, they're called Orinco, that's the company, but they're like these massive semi-trucks that just fly down the street back and forth. And so it's a common thing for pets to be killed on that road. Pretty quickly after moving in, they meet their neighbor, his name is Judd, and he leads them to a pet cemetery, which is located behind their property. There's a path that leads over to the pet cemetery. And that's where kids in the town, local kids, have buried their pets that have died. And after that trip, their daughter gets super agitated because she doesn't want her cat, Winston Churchill, to die. At this point, this book has been out for so long, and I think a lot of people have watched the movie, that most of this will probably already have been spoiled for you, especially the part about how the cemetery will bring any living thing, well, dead thing, I suppose, that was buried in it back to life. So yeah, I won't say more for those of you that maybe don't want it fully spoiled, but it involves dead things coming to life. I won't say that Pet Sematary is the scariest of the Stephen King books that I've read, even though Stephen King considers it the scariest book that he's written. And part of that is because it's not scary in the like gotcha kind of way. I think The Shining is probably the one that shines in that regard. But Pet Sematary discusses grief. And I've said this in my reading vlog, and I'll say it again here. I don't think that it is a book that delves into the deep grief that comes with losing a child, for example, because I don't think he discusses that in detail from either Lewis's or his wife's perspective. Like, we see them grieving, but we don't get insight into how deep the grief is. I think the more the focus is, he's presented with this choice that is very clearly not the right thing to do. It's going to have these obvious negative consequences, and he just can't help himself, and eventually drives him to a place that he really can't come back out of, and destroys his family in the end. So it's a little bit scary in that particular regard. Either way, I'm really glad that I read Pet Sematary. Would recommend it. It is very classic Stephen King. And I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Moving on to Mexican Gothic. So I read Mexican Gothic again as an October horror pick. This was the second and last one for the month. Mexican Gothic, I actually had it on hold for quite a while, and I just got my hands on it in October, so I got really lucky. And I got the audiobook, which is mostly how I listen to this book. I would say 90% of this book I just listened to on audiobook over the course of a weekend while I was just doing random things around my apartment, like cleaning my coffee table so I can finally leave it here instead of dragging it out of the shot every time I set up to film. So the book begins with the main character, Noemi. She is going to the countryside. So the book is set in Mexico. She lives in Mexico City. But she's going to go to the countryside to her cousin's house because her cousin sent a letter to the family, and it was very suspicious, very mysterious, and they're very concerned about her. Cousin was just recently married, so Noemi's family is suspicious of the husband. So she goes over there, and they're staying in this huge mansion at the top of the hill that seems to be very isolated. And pretty quickly after she arrives at the house, she begins having these really weird dreams that are pretty horrific, but also very realistic, as if they're actually happening. But then she wakes up and is convinced that they are dreams. There are definitely some horror elements in this book. This is a true horror book, but it's not an extreme horror book. Like, I don't think that this would scare most people. It certainly wasn't scary to me. I can only think of like one super gory scene, but basically, yeah, only one scene like that stands out. But I do feel that this book is rather long. And it lacks a suspense factor that might be, or it doesn't have an extreme suspense factor. I really did want to know what was going to happen in the end. And truthfully, by the time I got close to it, I already predicted how it would end. Like really right down to exactly what happened to the house. I predicted that's what was going to happen. But I really did still enjoy the story and the characters. The biggest critique for this book is that it is very slow. And I think that's true. It is very slow. It takes a lot of time for the author to reveal the creepiness in the house, and even longer, pretty much the entire book, to reveal the backstory of the house and the family. I'm almost certain that if I had sat down to read this book like I normally do, I would feel the same way as a lot of people about how slow it was. Because I was multitasking as I was listening to this book for the vast majority of the book, that's probably why I came away enjoying it a lot more than a lot of people have as well. Still fantastic read, one of my favorites this month for sure, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. All right, next book is Next Year in Havana by Chanel Clayton. Now, actually, this book's cover and Mexican Gothic's cover, they look really similar. I forgot to say that about Mexican Gothic. The cover on that book is absolutely beautiful. That's kind of why I picked it up, even though I only have the ebook version and then listened to the audiobook for most of it anyway. So I guess I didn't appreciate or get to appreciate the cover as someone who actually bought the book. But still, it's really beautiful. And so is the cover on this book, Next Year in Havana. So I saw that this book was set in Cuba, and that's actually, I'm not even gonna lie, the main reason that I picked it up. I read one other book set in Cuba this year, the Book of Lost Saints, and I really enjoyed it. And this is similar in that it is set in the period of the Cuban Revolution, and it kind of highlights the struggle of the people that are living in Cuba during this time. So this book in particular, Next Year in Havana, I would say that it is historical fiction. But there's also like 2 romance storylines that are kind of like underlying the book. So I would also classify it as romance, but not necessarily historical romance. But it's also contemporary because one of the storylines is set in present day and only the other one is set in the past. So yeah, this is a really hard book to classify, but I'll go over the characters. So Elisa's story is the one told in the past, and then Marisol is the story that is told in the present. And Elisa is Marisol's great-grandmother. And so she was born and raised in Cuba in a very wealthy family, but there's a lot of unrest going on in this time. And so there's a change in power, and eventually her family has to flee for their safety. So they leave their home and they go to the United States and settle down in Florida. Her storyline is basically all of the events up to them leaving Cuba and going to the United States, particularly her family struggling with a brother that has left because of differing ideologies, and her as she's falling in love with a revolutionary whose life is pretty much in danger by the Cuban government. He feels this really strong need to fight for the ideas that he believes in as opposed to trying to conserve his life. And at the same time, or because of that really, Elisa knows that her dad will not allow her to actually be with or marry this guy. Of course, because she has to flee Cuba anyway, that kind of severs their relationship there. Marisol is returning to Cuba because Elisa has passed away in present day, and her final wish was that Marisol in particular take her ashes to Cuba and spread them wherever she thinks is appropriate, really. So she kind of has to pick this resting place for her great-grandmother. And so she has grown up hearing stories of Cuba from her family, particularly her grandmothers, and she realizes that she is stepping into a very different Cuba from the one that they knew and the one that they grew up with. So she grew up hearing a very romanticized version of Cuba, and in the reality she finds is that a lot of people are living in poverty and in fear of their government. So a lot of the stories in this book were of struggle. There was a lot of tenacity in here as well, and a lot of persistence. And basically, it's a classic case of the past is destined to repeat itself, because when Marisol goes to Cuba, she also begins to fall in love with a modern day Cuban revolutionary. This was a overall fantastic book. I actually really enjoyed it. I love the characters. Even after the book, I was still thinking about them, wanted to know how things worked out for them in the end. And it did end like pretty well, but also questionably. So like there are questions that you're left with as the reader at the very end that I just couldn't let go. So this was a 5 out of 5 star book for me. Definitely one of my favorite contemporary romances, or contemporary slash historical romance or historical fiction that I've read so far this year. And then the next 3 books on my best of them list are contemporary romances. The first one is Roommate by Soraya Wilson. And this was an Amazon Prime's first read, I think for August. I always read them a month behind because the audiobooks aren't released until the following month. And then I always like pick them up because they're super cheap. And I like to read the books with the audiobook. I would say Roommate is probably the most wholehearted romance that I've read this year. It was a lot of fun. It was like a romantic comedy, and in fact, I think all of these basically could be classified as a romantic comedy of sorts. The main character is Madison, and she comes from a very wealthy family in Texas, but she decides that she doesn't want to pursue the path that they have picked out for her. And instead, she steps away from the family and all of their money and decides that she's going to be an elementary school teacher. Except that now she has to contend with an elementary school teacher's salary. So she's trying to find a place to live at the beginning of the book. And her aunt, who is also her realtor, finds a living situation where she has to live with a roommate, but also basically clean the place and take care of his dog. And that's where the roommate comes in. She doesn't really know how to clean, having grown up in a wealthy family, but she's basically trying to fake it till she makes it. And so the person she's moving in with is Tyler. And Tyler's one specification was that he wanted a roommate that was in a relationship because he didn't want his roommate to fall for him because he had had some really crazy experience, blah, blah, blah. So basically, the rest of the book is Madison trying to deny the fact that she likes Tyler, but Tyler also starts to get feelings, and you can see where this is going to go. I felt like this book was maybe a little repetitive at times because of the fact that Madison is contending with, I like him, but I can't tell him, and that's like over and over and over again. But overall, it was a totally fun, easy read. I am, of course, very partial to reading about teachers, being one myself. So yeah, I give this maybe 3.5 to 4 out of 5 stars. And then the next book I read is Marriage on Madison Avenue by Lauren Lane. So this one I only picked up because it was just readily available from my library. So I figured, why not? I was looking for something to read. Turns out, I didn't know this when I read this, really until the end, but this is the 3rd book in a series. I think it's called the Central Park something series, or Pact series, because the girls made a pact in it. They do begin with the backstory, so I guess you don't really need to have read the previous books in order to understand what's going on. But basically, there are these 3 women who are all dating the same guy. One of them was married, one of them was dating, and so was the other one, but none of them knew the other existed until he dies, and they all show up to his funeral and put the pieces together. So yeah. And somehow out of all of that, they decide to become friends and make a pact to protect one another from all of the men who may not have very much integrity out there. So this book is Audrey's book, and she is like a social media influencer source, I guess. I know that I think she has like a large Instagram following, and that's what her job is. And she lives in New York City. Her best friend, Clark, also lives in New York City, and they've been friends for pretty much almost their entire lives. Clark, the guy, has a very strained relationship with his family, and his mom is trying to set him up with one of his exes who ditched him, and he doesn't want that. So he lies to her and to the press and says that he is engaged to Audrey. Apparently, this is also not the first time that he's done that. And so now they have to keep up this ruse of being engaged and how far they're going to take it. And they kind of take it pretty far. So like at one point they have to decide whether they're going to go through with an engagement party that involves all of their friends and family, despite them actually still faking it. There's like this super expensive wedding planner that Clark's mom sets him up with to try to call him out on their bluff, that they have to decide whether or not to meet with. Eventually, there's a venue that becomes available that they have to decide whether or not to book. So the stakes get pretty high as they're carrying this out. But who knows? Maybe while they're pretending, they actually do fall in love with one another. Guess you'll have to read the book to find out. Overall, I actually enjoyed this book. I thought it was pretty lighthearted, and really the friendship between the two, it's a friends to lovers. I liked their friendship. It was a really fun friendship. Also, the friendship between the three women in this book, because they kind of are like the supporting characters, they pop up here and there. That was also really fun to read. They obviously care a lot about each other, and it's cool to just see a group of girls that support each other in that way. Yeah, I gave this one like 4 out of 5 stars. I think I may pick up the other books in the series at some point in the future. I'm not in a rush to get to them, but I did like this one enough to pick those up. All right, and then the last of the best of them is The Honey Don't List by Christina Lauren. This was a fun one. This is my second Christina Lauren book. I can't remember what the first one was. I'd have to look this up later. But I know I've read a book by her, and I also know that I prefer this one to that book. So Carrie is the main female character. She works for this couple who are basically like this book's version of like an HGTV couple. I feel like they're modeled after Chip and Jo Gaines from that show. I forget the name of the show, but if you watch HGTV, you know what I'm talking about. Because basically this couple, they are popular for remodeling, and then they get their own Netflix show, basically doing remodeling, as well as relationship advice. So they wrote a book on relationship advice because they are known for having this awesome relationship, except they actually kind of hate each other. And so part of Carrie's job is to make sure that no one finds this out by trying to make sure that they're not arguing with each other in public where people have cameras and can post to like Twitter. However, her boss kind of sucks and takes advantage of her, and the fact that she has this health condition where she requires health insurance for, and so she can't just get up and leave because her boss is providing her the health insurance that she needs. Yes, this book is definitely set in America. The male lead, James, he recently joins the company because the old company that he worked for has completely dissolved due to fraud. Similar to like Bernie Madoff style, there was definitely something like that going on there. And so he's got this black mark on his resume and can't get a job anywhere else. This couple is the first one that will hire him, and so he snatches it up, but it ends up not being what he expected. He is an engineer, but he's now becoming an assistant to the husband of the couple. And then both Carrie and James have to go on tour with the couple because they need to basically babysit them and make sure that they don't kill each other when they're supposed to be like spreading this image of insane love to their fans in order to keep their deals. I like both of these characters. I feel like they were dealing with some pretty real life problems with Carrie and her condition, and then she made James pretty nerdy, but also very kind. So he was helping her out whenever he knew that she couldn't do things because of the condition in her hands. I don't know, I just feel like that made them a little bit more realistic than some of these very unrealistic contemporary romance characters can be. Overall, it was a super quick, super fun read. This was about a 4 out of 5 stars, and yeah, I liked it. I think that if you are considering it, definitely pick it up. And on to the rest of them. Luckily, there actually weren't that many. I have 3 books that I was less than impressed with this month. The first one is a popular one. I read Normal People by Sally Rooney. Now, Normal People is one of 3 books that I had picked up to read because I think they were like the top 3 books on Goodreads, either of this year or the previous year. Probably the previous year. I can't remember, but they were the top 3, and it was this one, Where the Crawdads Sing, and also Little Fires Everywhere. And I have to say, I don't trust these Goodreads lists because I was less than impressed with most of those books on that list. I thought Where the Crawdads Sing was okay. I actually did like Little Fires Everywhere, but Normal People, I didn't really love this one. It is very much a coming of age story. So it follows these teenagers as they start in high school and eventually they get to college. I think it ends before they actually do graduate college. And I almost feel like this book captured the teenage angst a little bit too well because that's kind of what I didn't love about it that much. I didn't enjoy reading all of that. So the characters are Marianne and Connell, and Connell is poor. He's being raised by a single mom, but in high school, he's super popular. Marianne comes from a wealthy family, but she's kind of super weird, so she's not very popular in high school. But when they get to college and they end up going to the same college, the roles kind of reverse, where Marianne comes into herself and now she's the popular one, and then Connell is having trouble, I guess, fitting into a social circle there, and Marianne helps him out. Part of what's frustrating about this book is that they're together and then they're not, and then they are and then they're not. And it's all because of the fact that they are not communicating properly. But it's not even just like kind of miscommunication they would expect. Like, this is really bad miscommunication, even for teenagers. Like, so much of their issues in this book could have been avoided if they just talked to one another and maybe elaborated on what they were saying for just like 1 or 2 more sentences. I feel like this, I don't know if it's classified as YA or adult, but this felt very YA, and that's probably why I didn't love it that much. Also, I really didn't like the ending. And I can't really talk about it without giving away spoilers, but it just felt like they went through all of that just to have it end that way. It just didn't make any sense. This was a 2.5-star read for me. And then we have Whiteout by Danielle Gerard. And this was another Amazon Prime's first read. This is a thriller novel. And it's actually part 1 in what is, I think, going to be a series that I certainly will not continue to read. So this thriller is set in North Dakota, but that is not the most boring part of this book, let me tell you. So the story starts with this girl who, she was in a car accident, so she finds herself in this wreckage. She's getting herself out. The driver that she was with is dead, but she's completely lost her memory. She doesn't know who she is or how she got there. She eventually figures out her name because she finds an ID in her purse or something like that. So she knows that her name is Lily. And she's trying to make her way back into the town. Now, the same night that she is involved in that wreck, there's a murder of a young woman in town. And this is very unusual for that town because no one knows who that young woman was in a town where everyone knows everyone. And one of the detectives, she's a newer detective, gets assigned to the case. Now, this detective is super salty because I think she used to work in the city and then they transferred her to this small town police department. And so she's out to prove herself so she can go back to the big city because she just doesn't want to be there. And then Lily also brings in the help of a really old friend who they hadn't talked to each other in a really long time, but she doesn't know that because she's lost her memory. And they're trying to get her to piece together everything that she's forgotten. Overall, this was just not a very well written thriller, in my opinion, which is too bad because I really did want to enjoy this. I think the book was too long. I really considered DNFing it, but I was already, a decent amount through. And this is my problem with books is I suffer from sunk cost fallacy. If I'm a certain way through, I can push through, especially if I have the audiobook as well. Most of the book, the main character doesn't even know what's going on because of her amnesia, and that doesn't help the story at all. I lost interest maybe at the 50% mark, and then the ending wasn't even that huge of a surprise. You could kind of see who the bad guy was going to be. So I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars, and I'm not going to be continuing this series, unfortunately. And then the last book on this list is Fix Her Up by Tessa Bailey. This book was a hot mess, and not in a good way. I read one of Tessa Bailey's book and I liked it enough that that's why I decided to pick this one up, and that was a mistake. I think this one is one of her earlier works though, so I guess maybe she's gotten better, which is good. So maybe I'll give her another shot in the future, but this one was just not it. So the main character is Georgie. She is a clown for a living. So she does like kids' birthday parties where she dresses up as a clown, and she wants to start her own entertainment company. Her biggest issue in life is that people don't take her seriously. So her family still think of her as this super young woman, and she wants them and really everyone to take her seriously so that she can start her company. I don't know how much sense that makes, but sure, that's what we'll go with. Then there's Travis, who is a former pro baseball player. And I think he had an injury that basically took him out of the game, and he's moping around. He also has a reputation, and it's not a good one, of kind of just sleeping through women. And he has this ridiculous nickname. I don't even remember it, but yeah, he's just not a good influence. And so he wants to get a position at, I think, a network television station where he's one of the commentators. And in order to do that, he needs to have a more wholesome appearance. So these two decide they're going to date each other so that she can look more serious and he can look more wholesome. Now, the problem with this book is that I really did not like Travis. This is one of those books where the male lead is written as this like crazy, overprotective and jealous, hypocritical guy. And I really don't like those books with this kind of male lead. The other thing is the audiobook for this is not that great. The audiobook for Travis's voice is basically the female voice, but like lowering her voice and pretending to be male. It's very obvious, and it just made the reading experience for this book that much worse. Another one where I considered DNFing it and I powered through. However, this was a 2-star read for me. I cannot recommend this one, really. I think that her other books are better. So if you want to read something by Tessa Bailey, just pick the other one. It's way better than this one was. All right, guys, that is the end of my October wrap up. It is still not technically the end of the month. It's like October 26th as I'm filming this. So it's possible that I'll get in another one book at least before the month is truly out. And maybe I'll include that in my November wrap up. But thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed me babbling on about all the books that I read this month. And I will catch you all in the next one.